Thank you. My name is Mont. My pronouns are he, him, and I'm going to share my screen. There we go. I'm a member of the Voting Method Reform Subcommittee of our chapter's Electoral Working Group, and we have drafted a memo, which we will share in the chat at some point. Possibly some of my co-committee members will do that, or I will do that after my talk. The memo is meant to be an introduction to the topic of voting method reform and why our chapter should care about it. Right now, I want to give a shout out to Robert E., who made the awesome cartoons that you'll see and did the layout of the memo, and to Farah C. and Jenna K., who rounded out our subcommittee. The goal today is to give information to help you answer 3 questions. How do voting methods work? How do we pick one? And why should we care? A warning, the last one is very easy, but the first 2 questions are very complicated. A couple notes before we start. We're going to talk about single winner elections. The vast majority of the elections in this country are for single winner positions, and the basics of voting science can most easily be seen in them. I'll be using terms voting method and voting system interchangeably to mean the set of rules used to pick a winner of an election, as opposed to, for example, a computer system designed to count the ballots. And then technically there are many ranked choice voting methods, but ranked choice voting, or RCV, has come to be understood to refer to a certain method technically called instant runoff voting. So that's how I'll use it in this context. Okay, plurality voting. The method used in most elections in this country, AKA first past the post or choose one. You cast one vote for a single candidate, and the candidate with the most votes wins. This method is terrible. It is unrepresentative. Studies have shown that it fails upwards of 25% of the time. That is to say, 1/4 of elections using FPTP elect a candidate that is not the candidate that would make the most voters happy. It supports duopoly. It's been mathematically proven that plurality voting tends toward a 2-party system because of the incentives of the voters and the candidates. And it elects extremists. I don't mean extremist the way it's used in the news. I just mean it a candidate that is closer to the edge of a group's opinion, the opposite of a centrist. So why should we care? That's, like I said, a pretty easy answer. Like I said, plurality is terrible for these reasons. And we want an election that elects the right candidate. And we as DSA members want people to be able to vote for DSA, right? So that's why we should care. Besides plurality, there are 2 main classes of voting methods. There are ranked methods, where you rank candidates in relation to each other, and there are score methods, where you score them based on a range, 0 to 5, 0 to 10, etc. Let's spend a little bit of time with ranked methods first. A ranked method would use a ballot like this. All of the ranked methods there listed would use the same ballot and would collect the same voter data, but they would use a different algorithm to pick the winner. For instance, instant runoff uses a series of automatic runoffs, eliminating the least popular candidate, reallocating votes, et cetera, until you're left with one winner. Borda, on the other hand, converts the rankings into points and then adds up the points. So here's a sample election with the information gathered from the ranked ballots. Again, every ranked method would gather this information. 3 candidates, left, center, and right, pretty evenly split. All of A's voters would like B second best and C third best. C's voters also like B second best. B's voters are split. Some like A second best, some like C second best. So how do we pick a voting method for this election? Well, let's consider some criteria. There are many different criteria we could consider. I've put them into 2 categories, scientific and quote unquote real world. The scientific criteria are how the voting method would behave in a lab. And there are a lot of them. But let's look at the first one, the Condorcet criterion. If a candidate exists that would beat all other candidates in a head-to-head matchup, that candidate should win the election. That seems like a reasonable criterion to base an election method on. So let's apply it to this election. In this election, with a Condorcet method, B would win because 66% of voters all the B voters and all the A voters like B over C. And 64% of voters, all the B voters plus the C voters, like B over A. So B handily wins this Condorcet election. Let's look at a different election where B's primary support is much smaller. In this, with the Condorcet method, B still wins because majorities, although smaller majorities, still prefer B over any other candidate. Let's look at a third election. B has very tiny primary support. Only 1.5% of voters like B first, but B will still win this election under a Condorcet method. So if you're like me, your spidey sense might be tingling a little bit and thinking, what is going on here? What's wrong with this criterion? Well, it turns out a lot of voting methods fail the Condorcet criterion, and that means they don't always pass it. When you look at instant runoff voting, for instance, if you look at this election, under plurality, A wins, under Condorcet, B wins, but under IRV, or ranked choice voting, C would win. And in fact, C wins under instant runoff voting each of these elections. So maybe Condorcet isn't the criterion we want to prioritize. Here are some others. Here's one called favorite betrayal. With favorite betrayal, dishonest voting should not be incentivized. You might know this as the lesser of two evils. Voters should not have an incentive to vote someone else over their favorite, right? They shouldn't feel pressure to vote for a lesser of two evils, okay? Here's another one, similarly dealing with dishonest voting and how it shouldn't be incentivized. It's called late or no harm. Basically, giving a ranking or rating to your second favorite candidate shouldn't cause your favorite candidate to lose. You shouldn't be penalized by expressing support for secondary, third candidates. You see there, late or no harm is actually incompatible with favorite betrayal and Condorcet. You can't have a voting method that satisfies both. Here's a very simple criterion, majority criterion. If one candidate is ranked or scored first by a majority, more than 50% of voters, that candidate should win. That seems very, very fundamental, but I will tell you now that many voting methods don't pass this criterion, and many people think that this is not a criterion that should be fundamental to your voting method. This is a chart of voting methods on the left that are all good and reasonable, and then criterion on the top. And you can see no voting method even comes close to satisfying all these criteria that people think are reasonable criteria. If you choose a voting method only by scientific criteria, you're going to be out of luck. I want to go back now for a second to the types of voting methods. We looked at this election and how it might behave under a couple of ranked methods. What does this election look like with a score method? The main difference with score methods is that they allow voters to express more nuanced opinions. So these two voters, not 1 and 2, both prefer A, then B, then C. But voter number 1 really likes A, only barely likes B, and hates C. And voter number 2 likes A and B almost equally, but barely prefers A. So under a score method, all the voter scores would be tallied, and then the candidate with the high score would win. Score methods you would use about like this. You can give candidates equal scores. You can see here that this voter gave Abby and DeAndre the same score. Score methods are easy to tabulate. The results are easy to display. They don't incentivize lesser evil voting, and they tend to favor consensus candidates. One negative is that score methods fail late or no harm. Voters are incentivized to give their favorites the top score possible and give everyone else a 0. This is also called bullet voting. And score methods, when this strategy takes over, devolve into approval voting. Is that a bad thing? Approval voting. Approval voting is a method that is technically a score method. It's just on a range of 0 to 1. You can say yay or nay to any of the candidates. It's incredibly simple. And in fact, it delivers surprisingly representative results. It delivers better results than plurality, better than instant runoff by many measures, better than almost every method. And it's been adopted in recent years by Fargo, North Dakota, and St. Louis, Missouri. It's also been informally adopted by our chapter in Mattermost, when we do emoji polls, we usually are able to express preferences, yes or no, for many different options. Someone here posted a poll for which sections of the national platform to be discussed during a breakout session. And people can express their interest in as many of them as they like. Now, this particular example I pulled is actually a bad one because whoever posted this, and I'm sorry, I don't know if you're here, asked voters to only vote for 2 candidates. And when you limit voting like this is actually not really much better than just voting for 1. So I don't know if the person who posted this is here, but everybody, I encourage you when you're posting emoji polls, allow and encourage voters to express support for as many candidates as they want. It will give you much better results in your election. So approval voting is actually really great, but if you don't like that you can only say yay or nay, if you want the nuance of a ranked or scored method, right? And you like a scored method, but you're concerned that it fails later no harm, you might like STAR voting. STAR stands for Score-Then-Automatic-Runoff. It's a score method. You score all the candidates, the scores are tallied, but then there is an automatic runoff between the top 2 highest scoring candidates, and your vote goes to the candidate you prefer. It has the benefits that score voting has, but the automatic runoff incentivizes honest voting. It doesn't completely solve later no harm, but it incentivizes you to express an opinion and not bullet vote. Because if you bullet vote, you're throwing away your vote in the runoff, unless your favorite candidate makes the runoff. So though there are many voting methods out there, there are 3 besides plurality that are under serious consideration and have support across the country. Ranked choice voting, also known as instant runoff voting, is already used in many municipalities across the country. Approval voting, right, has just been adopted by 2 cities. And then STAR voting that has been introduced in several state legislatures and is being considered in places across the country. And these 3 methods are the 3 methods that our memo looks at more closely and compares. This is a matrix of the 3 different methods plus plurality, looking at various criteria that are these real world criteria that I talked about. So I encourage all of you to look at our memo. We think this is a very important issue for these reasons. So hopefully the memo's been dropped in the chat. I haven't been able to look at the chat. I will look at it now because I'm sure there are some questions. I'm now ready to take questions from anybody who has them.
Excellent, thank you. Does anybody have questions? Going once.
Dusty.
Okay, Dusty.
Dusty, you're muted.
Oh my gosh, sorry about that. What is your view on the fight for an open primary in Oregon? How does that influence sort of the strategy of DSA and, I don't know, gaining power that way, or, you know, winning elections in a much broader field, not so narrowly focused?
My personal opinion is that open primaries aren't any good unless the voting method that comes with them solves the problem. If you have an open primary with plurality, or open primary with plurality plus a top 2 runoff, which is used in California, right, you're still going to end up with the same duopoly problems, even though the primary is open. That's my opinion. Don.
It looks like it's Don. Yeah, Don, if you could just, if you're able, if you could put it in the chat, because it's really hard for me to see raised hands.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, sure. Sorry about that. Yeah, so Mont, Chris, hi, a great presentation. Thanks. I was curious. I know right now there's a charter commission underway in Portland, and they're looking at major changes to Portland's form of government, probably hopefully get rid of the commission form and go to some kind of district representation, et cetera, et cetera. I was wondering, is this something that they could consider changing the method of voting, or is that by state law? Do you happen to know?
Yeah, I do actually. So this is one reason that we should be really engaged. They are definitely considering voting method change for a couple of reasons. One, which I really glossed over in my presentation, is that there are some voting methods that allow you to eliminate a primary. I mean, technically, we don't have to have primaries, but primaries are a way of winnowing down the number of candidates and still having somewhat representative results. So the city club report recommended eliminating primaries. Primaries, the people who show up to vote in primaries are older and whiter and more affluent than general election voters, and so they're not as representative. So there are lots of reasons to get rid of primaries, and you need a voting method that can handle that can handle a general election with many candidates. So that's a big reason that they're considering it, and there definitely are. I mean, I've talked to some charter commissioners. Voting method is definitely on the table, and they're considering. It looks like right now they're considering ranked choice voting and star voting, and I'm not sure how much they're considering approval voting. But I would be surprised if they didn't recommend a change.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mont, Chris, for that excellent red talk.